Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see you through this webinar, and I want to share some words at the beginning. First, let me tell you that this event is part of the series of dialogues started in April to analyze the effects that the pandemic has on statistical operations. We have had a conversation with the countries of the Caribbean and Latin America on the issues of price data collection, national accounts, balance of payments and external trade, and employment and household surveys. These events are held as part of the Knowledge Transfer Network webinar series, and they are jointly organized with the National Institute of Statistics from Chile, which we appreciate a lot. In addition, we have benefited from the valuable collaboration from Statistics Canada, which has a strong support for statistical development in the Caribbean region. In the past 2 months, we have worked in close coordination with ILO to support countries in how to implement alternatives to carry out employment surveys and other household surveys under the new circumstances. Several Latin American countries have continued surveys, and therefore it was necessary to find quick solutions so as not to lose the continuity of the employment surveys and other statistics. Based on this experience, both institutions, ILO and ECLAC, have formulated a series of recommendations to help countries make the transition from paper-based surveys to telephone surveys. This process involves several challenges: retrieving the phone numbers and previously used samples, reducing and adapting the questionnaires, implementing change in technology, and training so that the interviewers can carry out the survey, analyzing the presence of bias in the estimates and applying the procedures to correct it, among many other processes that we have to adapt. On this occasion, in this event, our colleague from ILO, Kieran Walsh, and Andres Gutierrez from ECLAC will present us with a summary of the general situation regarding the implementation of employment surveys and a summary of the recommendation made for their implementation. Subsequently, we will have 2 presentations. The first one by Diana Castillo Trejo, Deputy Director General of the Statistical Institute of Belize, and our colleague Halim Brizan, Director of the Central Statistical Office in Grenada. Belize is in the process of adapting their labor force survey to make it suitable for telephone interviewing in the next month. Grenada, in the other way, is currently implementing their labor force survey, and they have also added COVID-19 question in their questionnaire. We consider that this experience can illustrate some of the challenges faced along the process adopting telephone interviews, and they are very useful reference points for our discussion and comments after the presentation. In administrative issues, we will have 15 minutes after the 4 presentation, we will have 15 minutes, and after the 4 presentation, we will have a round of 40 minutes for comments and questions. So we look forward to the active participation of all of you, sharing your experience and the challenges you have faced. From ECLAC and ILO, we are at your disposal to provide technical support in all of the issues. So then, to begin, I would like to give the voice to our colleague Kieran Walsh from ILO, just to give his presentation. Kieran, you have the voice, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I will again share my presentation. One moment, please. Okay, there we go. Continue. Now, can everyone see my presentation? And I will get going.
Perfect, we can see it.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to give this presentation. Really, with the time available, I'm just going to give an overview of the range of guidance we have and some of the key issues covered. And I think ultimately the idea will be that as there is need for follow-up, we can have more detailed follow-ups on a country-by-country basis, like we've already been doing for some of the countries in the region, in collaboration with ECLAC, of course. So the background from our side is that by now we have published 4 complementary notes on COVID-19 impacts on labour market statistics. The first note was published towards the end of March. Actually, I think it was the 1st of April, in fact. And that was an overview of the challenges countries were facing and the responses they were making in the early period. So things like having to shut down their face-to-face interviewing, introducing telephone, changing questionnaires, this range of things. And we had information from about 100 countries at that stage, and we've been getting updates. Note 2 was more conceptual or content focused, particularly dealing with some special cases that arise now in COVID-19 and how to treat them in line with international standards, because we were getting a lot of queries along those lines. Note 3, which is the main focus of what I'm talking about today, is guidance on the different options available to countries to maintain their labour force survey data collection, covering issues like Grenada and Belize and many others, in fact all others, are facing. Note 4 is a guide on capturing impacts on employment and unpaid work using rapid surveys, because as we're all aware, there is a rapid increase in the number of rapid surveys, and I'll mention that very, very briefly at the end. So the guidance, this note 3 as I'm calling it, guidance on maintenance of LFS data collection, unsurprisingly the mode of impact is the primary influence on the mode of data collection, excuse me, is the primary impact on the impact, sorry, it's the primary impact on your processes, excuse me. So those with face-to-face interviewing are having suspensions of data collection, and that is approximately 80% of countries based on a survey we did in 2018 on LFS practices. Now that didn't cover all the world, but there were 120 countries who provided information. So it really shows us that the majority of countries in the world are still relying on face-to-face as a main mode. Well, yeah, main method. Those with regular collection, quarterly, monthly, etc., have generally been trying to move their collection to telephone interviewing, as is also the case in this region. And the challenges depend on the existing systems, infrastructure, and availability of contact details in particular. Now, what this graphic shows is, broadly speaking, what the guidance, what this Note 3 covers. Okay, and it's organized to some extent by scenario. So scenario 1, as we refer to it in the guidance, is a case where there is a survey planned and it was intended to carry it out fully using face-to-face interviewing, either pen and paper interviewing or computer-assisted personal interviewing. So in these cases, the problem is generally that face-to-face interviewing has been suspended, and then countries have various options and challenges that they are facing. So in the guidance, we talk about the data collection challenges. So these are, the challenges up to and including the point where we have managed to collect information. And then alongside that, we have other methodological challenges, and as Antonio, I think, will be talking about quite a lot, the challenges of estimating bias, trying to reduce bias, and various related challenges like how the weighting approaches, and an overarching issue of quality assessment. So when everything is said and done, you have your data, you've done what you can with it, you need to assess the quality, and you need to decide how to publish that data, how to communicate what you have. In the guidance, we deal with various possibilities where you find that the bias is too great. For whatever reason. It can be because you weren't able to collect telephone numbers, you weren't able to complete interviews, or whatever the case might be. So that is something we also touch on in the guidance. Now, with that said, I will touch quite briefly on some of the most important and most obvious concerns. So when it comes to contact details and the sample frame, well, a starting point is that the preference is to retain the current sample design if possible, because that will have been based on a scientific frame. It will have been based on, we hope, good sampling methods, and so on. So that's the preference, but obviously not possible in all cases. So those frames and that selected sample may well, and most of the time does, lack contact details for those respondents. So within the guidance, we talk about the different options you face to attempt to address this problem of lack of contact details. And the first challenge really is to assess possible coverage through different approaches. And there's a real need to be flexible here. So you can look at combinations of sources, some that might be held by the NSO, maybe administrative data they have access to, and some external, so phone registers, and so on and so on. And the point ultimately will be to assess the coverage you can achieve through those methods and try to assess upfront possible biases to the extent you can. Now, the use of the existing sampling approach and frame is very important because it gives you some basis to assess bias. And the problem if you move to a different frame like phone registers or even random digit dialing is you lose a lot of your ability to assess bias when you go with those approaches, even if you have a possibility to get interviews. And so we're saying that we should assess alternatives to attach contact details to the frame or a selected sample. Some of the things which countries are using to attempt to help with this are introductory letters being sent to respondent households. This, of course, assumes that you have an address, and various types of searches, merging sources, local contacts. So, for example, using your local interviewers to use their network to try and get contact details for selected households and various other things. And it won't necessarily be just one of these that gives you everything. You might need to combine approaches and then assess the level of coverage you get. A very important option, which I also believe Antonio will talk about, is the reuse of old samples. There's a lot of sense to this. We would normally have reservations about doing this because of attrition, but in reality, panel approaches are widespread, so it's not impossible to revisit households. You may have to consider some legal aspects, like whether you have told the respondent you will contact them for this purpose, but methodologically, from a sampling perspective, this is not a bad approach in the current circumstances. Some countries are considering using alternative sampling frames, but as I've already mentioned, you need to be very careful with this. It's unlikely you will get something comparable to your existing sampling frame if you do this. Maybe not impossible, but quite unlikely, because if you take a phone register, there's going to be limited information on it to even assess the type of coverage you're getting. So yeah, it's not an ideal option, but it might be the best approach you have available potentially. And then regardless of option, care is needed to assess the coverage, possible biases, and it's not impossible, of course, that breaks in series may arise independently of the actual break in series you might see because of the situation, you know, the labor market impacts of COVID-19. And distinguishing those things might be difficult, in fact. So other challenges, well, there's the various practical challenges of enabling phone interviews, so getting the technology, the training, processes, legal requirements in place, and all of these things are country specific, really. Reviewing questionnaire content is important. Many countries are thinking about reducing the content of their interview to make it feasible to do by telephone, and that's perfectly realistic. But we do need to maintain priority items, and one of the notes I've mentioned, note 2, has some guidance on essential LFS content to make sure you can still derive your key indicators. Maintaining response rates is obviously an important challenge to be concerned with because you're now losing your face-to-face contact. Again, the guidance touches on these issues. And we have the issue of assessing bias, reviewing weighting approaches, and non-response adjustment. And this relates to your existing approach. Maybe one point I will touch on here is that if you do adjust your weighting approach, one of the things to consider will be whether you should also apply that new approach to your old data to improve comparability. So this is something to consider and something you will need to simulate with your existing data. So then there's another issue of selecting reference periods we talk about in the guidance. If you can do something without much delay, then you would generally maintain the existing intended reference periods. But if you're delayed, you have to start thinking about, well, at what point do I perhaps consider altering my approach? And this is something that's also referenced in the guidance. And then we have a section about assessment of quality and deciding on your dissemination strategy. So other things to note, I can't emphasize this enough, based on all our contacts with countries, national circumstances and infrastructure are critical, and the challenge is slightly different for every country, and therefore the correct response will be slightly different for every country. Some countries are already entirely using CATI and CAWI, and for those we have heard that there is relatively low impact, and in fact some of them are reporting an increase in response levels because people are more frequently available, but that is the minority. Now, many are partially using CAPI. This is, so for example, a first interview and then telephone interview for second and third interviews and so on. They are still also quite concerned and having quite large impact because of their loss of the first interview by face-to-face, meaning they can't get the contact details and so on. But it has to be noted that those with 100% face-to-face methods, which is many countries still, there is generally a major impact. Other issues that I'll very briefly mention to consider, so in our second note, you do need to carefully decide how to treat people on different types of absence depending on the national circumstances. So right now in many countries we have a huge increase in layoffs, which may be temporary, may be of unknown duration, may be permanent. And we have produced recommendations to try and guide countries on how to treat these cases in line with international standards. But it's fair to say the international standards were not written with something like COVID-19 in mind. But nonetheless, we do believe it's possible to have treatments that are consistent, but we've provided some clarifications. But we also recommend to use supplementary analysis to illustrate impacts. And here we're talking about data that's often collected but just not highlighted. So the reasons for absence. As I say, we would expect a massive increase in the number of layoffs, and that is generally a reason that's captured when people ask about absence. So many countries are already making use of that type of information, additional use of information about working time to illustrate how COVID-19 is impacting things. Now, our fourth note, the most recently published, is about rapid surveys. These can be considered as a way to generate data on labour market impacts and maybe won't necessarily use representative samples and so on. And we would say they're potentially a very useful source of information, but we need to be clear that they are unlikely to generate comparable information to your labour force survey. So people should not be planning for them as a complete replacement, because you will almost certainly break your series. I mean, I would say certainly break your series, because you're unlikely to ask the same types of questions, and the sample is unlikely to be fully representative. So other summary messages, and this is where I'll finish. The challenges are major in this case, undoubtedly. Maintaining any continuity or flow in your data will be an important achievement, and it's hoped that users can be aware of that. This is not automatic that it can be achieved, even though there's very high demand. The challenges do vary substantially by country, and the right solution can only be identified through assessment of the national context. And this is why, in addition to webinars like this, we and other agencies are having quite a lot of in-depth discussion with countries. Temporary disruption of publication may occur, is occurring in some countries indeed, and there needs to be flexibility of approach to try and maintain data. This can include using administrative data more than before, reusing old samples, as has been mentioned, rapid surveys, and so on. But in all cases, I think there needs to be very transparent focus on quality assessment and transparent publication to keep users informed. And my very final point is that I would say there will be a very natural temptation, I can imagine, to just return to old methods when the conditions allow. And indeed, that's quite realistic that people would approach it in this way. But I do think we all need to consider longer term lessons about resilience of data collection. We have the evidence that countries who were using CATI and CAWI had less impact. I mean, that's a certainty, it's clear. It's not a small development, we understand that, but we need to think about these things in case of future shocks that disrupt face-to-face data collection. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. And these are the links to the reports I was mentioning, the notes.
Thank you, Kieran.
My screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, good morning. I will be sharing this morning a bit about the experience that we have had in Belize with respect to the labor force survey in this time of COVID-19, the challenges that we have come upon, and some of the solutions that we are working on to try and ensure the continuity of this particular survey and of these very important indicators that come out of them. Okay, so I'll give a brief overview of what the labor force survey in Belize is traditionally, and then speak to the impacts that COVID-19 has had on our ability to conduct the survey, and then look at the alternatives that we have been looking at for data collection to ensure the continuity of the LFS, and some of the challenges that come with this, and also some of the opportunities that we see coming out of this. So traditionally, our labor force survey is done twice a year, in April and in September. We work with a sample size of 2,800 households countrywide, and we survey for a duration of 4 weeks. We use CAPI using tablets, and we collect data via face-to-face interviews exclusively. Our interviewers for the past few years have been working in teams, so they approach households in different areas that are sampled, and they go out as a team with a supervisor with them. This helps us to keep closer watch on progress and quality from out in the field, rather than having issues come to our attention long after data has been submitted. Since we use CAPI, we have real-time uploading of our data to the server. So as soon as that survey is completed, once the interviewer has internet access where they are, then data is synced to the server immediately upon completion of the interview. We have automated the process of cleaning and data processing, and our results are published within 2 months of the reference period. So we conduct the survey in April and September, and we publish our results in June and November. Now, prior to COVID-19, we were actually in the final stages of preparing for our 2020 population and housing census. So because we were about to go into the field for the census in May, we did not have an April labor force survey scheduled. All our resources were being put into the census preparations. However, the intention was that because we would be going in the field in May, which is not that far from the reference period, we could use data collected in May in the census to give us our key labor force indicators. We had already given some thought to how we would ensure comparability of the indicators that we obtain from the census, because there is usually a big disparity due to differences in reference period and the length of time that the data is collected and so on, between our regular labor force series and the figures that we get from the census. So we had already given some thought as to how we would make an adjustment there to ensure some comparability between the series so that we don't have a break in the series for 2020. And then we were expecting to be in the field for the census for 8 weeks. So we intended to conduct our September labor force survey as scheduled. However, you know, things have drastically changed for us. In early March of this year, our census was postponed in response to the approaching COVID-19 pandemic. In late March, we had our first confirmed case of COVID-19 detected in Belize, and so there were measures put in place by the government to proactively address or restrict the spread of the disease. At the start of April, our country went into a national state of emergency. And what this entailed was that there was restrictions to movement between communities and between districts. Almost all businesses and government offices were closed to the public, except for essential services. There was a national curfew imposed, and then there were social distancing requirements that were put into place in the law that limited the number of persons that could be allowed in any one space. So these restrictions right away limited our ability to do any kind of face-to-face interviewing, even if our office had remained open during this time. However, in May, there was some loosening of the restrictions because we weren't seeing any additional cases. Government offices reopened, some businesses reopened, and there were some lifting of some of the restrictions to movement. And during the month of May, our last COVID-19 positive patient tested negative, so we were able to loosen restrictions even further. At the start of this month, June, there was considerable relaxation of the social distancing requirements. So all of these things make it a bit more favorable for us to be able to go out and do some field work. However, despite the loosening of these restrictions, the country is still in a state of emergency. There are still some restrictions in place. We recognize that there is a lot of uncertainty about the possibility of doing any kind of face-to-face surveys for the rest of the year and possibly into 2021. So we are taking into consideration that even though right now we have some leeway to do some field work, that this might not always be the case and that this might change very suddenly. We also find ourselves, like many countries, in a situation where the country is just starting to emerge from what is an almost complete economic standstill. And because of this, government departments and government-funded agencies like the Statistical Institute of Belize are facing severe budget cuts that impact much of our planned activities for the year. And so our solutions were to ensure that we can still continue under these conditions to do an LFS. we made the decision to conduct the September labor force survey by telephone. We are looking at a sample size of about 3,000 households, and we have to make certain adjustments, meaning from the outset, in order to make this possible. So we know that we need a sample frame that's going to contain telephone numbers, contact information. We know that the questionnaire has to be shortened to facilitate the length of time that we can reasonably expect a respondent to be on the phone with us. We know that we have to set up an infrastructure that will allow for data collection by telephone. We have to make revisions to our training material with a focus on something that we haven't done before, telephone interviewing. And we have to make adjustments to how we monitor quality and progress, because we used previously a combination of monitoring in the field with the supervisors working very closely with the team, and also monitoring from headquarters as the data comes in. But now we have to find a way to transition to monitoring remotely exclusively for the most part. So we looked at several options of how we could go about putting together the sample frame, which is a big limitation that I think most of us have as we try to venture into telephone interviewing. So we looked first at the possibility of constructing a sample frame using administrative data from telephone companies. We made this request very early on, as soon as we realized that we may very well not be able to do face-to-face surveys this year. However, we encountered a lot of difficulty in obtaining the data that we required. From one company, we didn't receive any data. From another company, we got such limited data that it really wasn't going to be useful to even construct the beginnings of a frame. Of course, this type of frame made from administrative telephone data would be more at the person level rather than at the household level. So there's issues of comparability with our regular household survey frame. And then we know there are issues of bias, issues of coverage, and issues of how comparable any indicators that we get using this type of, or a sample generated from this type of frame would be to our existing series. We looked briefly at another option that I believe was shared with us in a previous webinar with ECLAC. Was the idea of using computer programming to generate a frame consisting of all possible telephone numbers for the country, and then using an automated process to contact each number and eliminate the ones that are non-existent numbers. And then from that, stay with a frame of existent numbers and then use that as the starting point of your frame. However, we recognize very quickly that this requires a lot of IT work, and there would be a very steep learning curve for our IT department, and it just wasn't something that was practical for the short amount of time that we had. And again, we would be looking at a sample frame that would be at the level of the person rather than at the household, and we would face the same issues of bias, coverage, and comparability with our existing series. So finally, we settled on option 3, which was to develop our own sample frame by conducting a listing exercise in which, in addition to the regular information that we collect when we do our listing, to also collect telephone and email contact information. We are fortunate in that we have a window of time where we can do some field work because of the loosening of the restrictions, because we haven't had any new cases in Belize. And so we want to take advantage of this window of time that we have to do a listing exercise on a randomly selected sample of enumeration district. And the intention is to use this as our sample frame for the labor force survey and possibly other surveys that we may want to do. So one of the big advantages of this is that it's the closest approximation to, or it will give us the closest approximation to our existing LFS sampling methodology, because basically we're constructing a frame in the same way, except that we're adding telephone numbers and email addresses to the households. This will also provide us with the most updated sample frame, and we will have some assurances as to the quality of the data that's contained in the frame because we are collecting it ourselves. Again, also, listing is something that we have experience and expertise in, so we know then that we have control over the timeline of how long this is going to take, and it allows us to plan better the entire process leading up to conducting the labor force survey. So our listing is scheduled to start in the first week of July. We are about to start recruiting our staff for that, and we expect to do training for the labor force survey in August, and the labor force survey itself to be conducted as scheduled in September, and hopefully results to be published as scheduled in November. So we recognize that there are a number of challenges that we have to address or that we will confront in this process. And so one is that there is the possibility that at any time the country could revert to lockdown conditions if there is a new case detected. It could jeopardize the listing exercise if it happens within that small window of time that we're looking at. However, we are doing our best to get the listing completed as quickly as possible. As I said, we're starting in the first week of July, and we want to make use of that window of opportunity to get at least the listing completed. We know that it is very unlikely that our borders will reopen before July, so we still think that we have sufficient time to do this safely, even given the risk that at any time we know that if a case is detected, we might revert to restricted conditions. We also face a lack of experience in the area of data collection by CATI. However, you know, it's something that we have to adjust. We have to figure this out, and we have to figure it out quickly. So we have been getting technical assistance from the ILO in terms of the content of the questionnaire and other areas. We've also been receiving some technical assistance from PRAC, and also some guidance in how to conduct the training for telephone interviewing from UNICEF, who they recently completed or about to complete a pilot for the mixed-sick survey, which included a component of follow-up telephone interviewing with the respondents. So we are fortunate that we are able to count on those partners for support in something in which we really don't have any experience at all. We expect, of course, a higher than usual non-response rate. So we intend to increase the sample size accordingly. And we also are including in our budget a contingency plan for doing follow-ups in the field. If we have persons who have or households who have no telephone information, or we have no contacts at the point of doing interviews, we are including a contingency plan to allow our interviewers to go in the field to do follow-ups with those households and hopefully try and get the interview completed for them. The questionnaire, of course, needs to be shortened to facilitate shorter interview times by telephone. So we have removed certain non-essential sections. The focus is on the economic activity module, and we're looking at the questions that we really need to obtain the key indicators. And here's an area that we have gotten a lot of input from the ILO in terms of how to get the most out of the questionnaire. We are also, I believe, adding or at least amending some of the questions to allow us to obtain some COVID-19 related information as well. There's the challenge of managing our workplace that requires social distancing. So even though our offices are open, there is a requirement for certain social distancing conditions to be met within the workplace, and so it's kind of hard to manage that within a call center setting. In fact, here in Belize, the call center operations are still not opened because of the risk involved in that type of setting. So what we will do is we will have the interviewers work from home. We have GSM compatible tablets that we had obtained for the census, and so they will be using those tablets to make the calls as well as to do the data capture. And one of the challenges that we are still yet to settle on how we will address it is how we're going to switch from doing monitoring of quality in the field to doing controlling for quality strictly remotely when our interviewers are in a work at home setting. We also see that this situation is, apart from being a challenge for us, it's a big opportunity because this is an area that we had really not given much consideration into branching off into. We were so used to our way of doing data collection. But here's an opportunity to build capacity in a new mode of data collection that we right now have no capacity in. It also opens the possibility of conducting other short surveys by telephone as the need may arise to capture pertinent and relevant indicators that track how COVID-19 is affecting our population. It also is very likely to be a much more cost efficient. Once we factor in the cost of the listing, which is the initial upfront cost, the labor force survey and any surveys that follow that will be done at a considerably lower cost because they will be done by this mode rather than having persons going out in the field and having the cost of transportation and so on. We have also even considered the possibility that our census, which we are hoping to conduct in May of 2021, that we may once again find ourselves in the situation where the country goes on a sudden lockdown, or because of the economic conditions that we are in right now, that the funding that we anticipate needing for the census may not be fully available. And so we are even looking at this and seeing how this experience can apply to conducting the census in some form or another and still getting the information that we require. Sorry about that. And then finally, we have all intentions to continue producing labor force statistics and other crucial statistics that monitor the socioeconomic conditions of our people. And so we have to adapt. We have to look at how we're going to do this, even in the face of pandemic, even in the face of major resource constraints. And so again, this is a huge opportunity for us to find new ways to do this, to adapt and to ensure that there is no major break in our series, that information is available for those who need it to make decisions and to plan for addressing, the social needs of the country and so on. So that is where we are right now. We still have a little ways to go, but I think that we have a much clearer direction now than we did a few months ago. So I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share our experience. I'm sure it's one that our colleagues in other countries will be able to relate to in terms of when the time comes for them to try and resume data collection for labor force and other important surveys. And I hope that the experience that we have had and that we have shared will be helpful to some of our colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana, for your excellent presentation. So it was a quick overview of since the beginning of the pandemic and the way that you are working in the proposal that you are doing for this survey that we are planning to launch in September, and all the works. So of course, if any support that you need from ILO and NECLAC, and of course of our colleagues from Canada through PRASC, so you can come with us. Now I will give the voice to our colleague Halim Brizan, who is the director of the Central Statistics Office from Grenada. So Halim, you have the voice. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Just going to share the file.
We can see your presentation.
Right, so good day everyone. And my presentation, Grenada Labor Force Survey in light of COVID-19. And here's the outline. I would look at some of the impacts on COVID-19 on our survey operation, how we have adapted our labor force survey for this quarter, and also to give you some examples of some COVID-related questions that we included, touch a bit on our survey mode during this time, and speak to some of the challenges. So the impact of COVID-19 on our survey operations, as with other countries, the LFS surveys have been adversely affected. And we have been grappling for some time as to how we can resume operations given the physical distance protocol. Obviously, as in the case of Belize, the face-to-face interviews have not been possible. Now, with our situation in Grenada, we have been lagging behind with the conduct of our quarterly labor force surveys. We do the labor force surveys on a quarterly basis, which we started in 2018. And but in 2018, we started in the second quarter, so we did not have a complete year. So, and when the lockdown happened, which was in March, we were actually about to conduct the fourth quarter for 2019. And this is because we had some mop-up work that we were concentrating on earlier in the year with our survey of living conditions and HBS survey, household budget survey. So as a result, we find ourselves in this position where we did not conduct the fourth quarter, and we really wanted to complete the year in 2019. So what we did, we continued to conduct the fourth quarter 2019 on telephone, and you would expect that resulted in a low response rate as a result of not having phone numbers for a large proportion of the household. That is no contact. However, what we did, because the surveys are done on a rotational basis, normally a third of the sample from the last quarter is normally rotated back, and also a third of the sample from the last year in the same quarter is normally rotated back. So we had contact numbers for about 545 households, which we used. And despite the low response rate overall, we were able to achieve out of the 545, we were able to achieve 498 interviews, which I thought is reasonably well for household interviews. And we have not made any changes to the length of the questionnaire. And I think it's because during that time, persons were at home mostly, and they had time available. I'm not too sure how it's going to be going forward. Well, obviously, we were unable to carry the first quarter. We didn't think that made any sense. So we may have to estimate using broad indicators. I'm not too sure what methodology is available where that is concerned. But we have been exploring ways of estimation. And so we have been planning vigorously to carry out the second quarter surveys. So in terms of the adaptation of the instrument, the questionnaire, which I must mention, we got significant assistance from the PRAS team at Statistics Canada. We have included some COVID-related questions. There's a module, and we have incorporated some of the, we have made changes to some of the options to include other options, and you'll see that in a few minutes. We also removed some other household type questions and other individual questions to reduce the length of the questionnaire. However, we still end up with a rather long questionnaire. And but we intend to do PR with the key message of economic recovery and national development to the population, letting them know the importance of this information during this time, because everyone is affected. So these are some examples of the COVID-related questions. It's not all of them. In the interest of time, I wouldn't report on all of them. And this question here is one that we have, what was the main reason for the person being absent from work during the reference week, right? And you see the options here, but this is a question already in the labor force survey, so we just adapted the response. Next, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement that the person might lose his her main job or main self-employment or main source of income in the next 4 weeks? Would you say, and these are the options here. And that last question is actually a part of the COVID module, which would be done after the labor force survey itself. So we would administer that module after. Now this one here, since April 1st, did the person or your employer make a new application for any of the following types of employment insurance benefits? This is another question, COVID-related question that we include in the module, and the options are there. During your last pay period, did you have any changes to your usual gross income as a result of the COVID situation? I didn't present the options in the interest of time. Also, we consulted our policy unit as to what information that they would want to see reflected or they would need information for. So they have given us a few questions to add. And this is one of the questions. What is your general outlook for Grenada's economy over the next 6 months? And also, how difficult has it, over the last month, how difficult was it for the household to meet its financial obligations? And also, whether or not the household currently have enough savings to sustain itself for the next 3 months. Now, this next question here is about our Social Security. We do have a question on that in the current questionnaire, and we thought that to supplement the question, because it's a need to find out about Social Security registration. And so we asked them, why are you not entitled to benefits from our national insurance scheme? Because we already asked the question if they are entitled to these benefits. And the options not registered have not been actively contributing. And the next question seeks to find out the reasons why persons have not been, why persons are not registered, because that has been a big issue in Grenada in terms of persons being able to qualify for unemployment benefits, because there's currently a program in light of the situation. We felt it necessary to add a question on education, and since that was a part of our current questionnaire, but to find out the medium that is being used during this period to continue the person's education, and also give the reasons for not being able to access online platforms, and that is specific to the school age population, because we know that there have been issues where that is concerned. Okay, so, and before I go on, I should say that a lot of the questions were questions used by Statistics Canada in their COVID-19 module to their LSS questionnaire, and we adapted it and we included additional questions which we felt was necessary for Grenada at this time. Our survey mode from CAPI to CATI, and interviewers, what we have done is that our interviewers have been using their traveling allowances to top up the phones to conduct entire interviews on phones using their assigned tablets, and that is the form of CATI that we are using. May not be CATI in the true sense of the word. Quality control continues with the spot checks by the office, 1 in every 5 interviewers. Built-in validation checks that already exists on the questions. Now in Grenada, we do not have supervisors as yet. We have not reached that stage. What we have is 15 interviewers, right? And normally the office staff does the supervision. So in terms of the challenge with the CATI, well, we know that it's normally a higher non-response rate, so that is expected. However, our experience of conducting the 4th quarter 2019 survey via telephone was that the respondents were very responsive, surprisingly, and we achieved a relatively high response rate based on the numbers that we had available. So we'll see how it goes. In terms of our sample selection, so we use the method of using a previous sample where telephone numbers were captured. And as I said, the sample is normally rotated. Right. So we did not do the normal. We chose not to go ahead with our usual sample design, and we used the previous sample approach because we thought that it would have been really difficult to find those the new numbers for the third of the sample that had to be rotated in. So factors we considered in choosing the best past sample. We looked at representation across the parishes in terms of the numbers available, and also the number of phone numbers that we had available, right? And what we also have to do is to look at the characteristics of the persons who we do not have any contact numbers for from the past survey, to see if there's any unique characteristics, so that we would not be introducing any bias, or we can account for those biases. So we use the 2019 second quarter sample. The sample size was 1365. Normally our sample size is fixed at that. And we had 1,052 households responding from that survey. And we were able to get 689 phone numbers, right? So you see that that is a challenge. And we intend to do searches from previous quarters to see if we will find some of the numbers available. And as a last resort, we intend to go out in the field and possibly leave callback cards to households, to those households that we do not have numbers for, because we have their GPS coordinates from some for those sampled households from the previous surveys. And to speak to some of our challenges that we are grappling with now, we were hoping that we were hoping that well, actually what happened is that very suddenly we found out that we did not have access to the World Bank Survey Solution server due to sudden changes in the bank policy, right? So that created an unexpected challenge for us, as we were hoping to be out into the field with the second quarter already. So now we have to find source a local server where the survey can be hosted, and we're currently in the process of doing that, right? In terms of well, the availability of the local server and the timeliness in setting up the server, it poses another challenge for us. And we're still not too sure of the reliability of that survey, since it would not be managed internally, but by our Ministry of ICT. And by that, we foresee a risk in terms of data security, and we have to therefore ensure that we incorporate appropriate security protocols, that the data is not accessible by anybody outside the stats office. So, and we really need to have our own server, so that this process can be effectively managed. Now, we are unable, given the situation, we are unable to apply the same level of monitoring of the interviewers, seeing that before they went out in the field, and we know they visited the household by the location, by the GPS coordinates. However, we would not be able to do that since the survey is done remotely via the telephone. And we do foresee some difficulty in getting response. I'm not too sure how much of the person who received the callback cards will be obligated to actually call back the office. So we do anticipate a overall low response rate, and we would have to test and see how this can be used, or how much reliable information we can get from this. I forget to mention that when we for our second quarter survey, that we will be using 3 reference week as opposed to 1 reference week, which we did in the past, where the reference week was actually in the last month of the quarter. So now we decided to use a reference week for every single month in the quarter, so that we can better capture the quarter, since things, given the situation, things have been changing rapidly. So we felt it's necessary to allocate our sample over that 3-month period and have different households apply different reference week to different households. And here ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Halim. Very interesting presentation, and very important for the work that you have done. And we have, before opening the floor for the questions and answers, I wonder if our colleagues from Statistics Canada wants to say, to add something about the work that you have done with our colleagues from Belize and Grenada.
Hi, Rolando. I will ask my colleague Leslie if she is still on to possibly say something if she wishes. Thanks. Do you see Leslie being logged on?
I don't see it. I don't know if it's our colleague from Steve.
Leslie Huntler?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, she's on mute now. Okay.
Can you open
Leslie, you can. Yes, I opened the microphone. She can speak now. Leslie, can you hear us? We can hear you. We cannot hear you. No, I think she has a problem with the audio. I go to make her panelist. Hey, Leslie, can you speak now? You can open your microphone. Now she has a problem with the audio.
Okay, let's try to solve this problem, and if done, we can open the floor for questions and answers. So the procedure is if you can ask in the chat that you want to say something, so we can open the floor and open the microphone to all of you. So the floor is open.
We have Janine Muir. I'll go to open the microphone here.
Okay.
Janine, you can
Hi.
speak now.
Hi, Janine. You have the floor.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to mention, because we've been working with Grenada, so with Aline's team, for the LFS survey so we work with him, as he mentioned, for the module that was added on COVID-19. So I think that here in Canada, we had good response to adding that module, and hopefully the work that's been done with Grenada will turn out to be good as well. No, I think there's a question.
No, is there anybody else that want to say something, or somebody else from Stat Canada that want to mention? Thank you for your comments. Lee. So we don't have any questions for our colleagues. Okay.
We have Statue Edwards. Statue.
Exactly. Can you open the microphone, please?
Yes. Yes, the microphone is open now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Strategists from Antigua and Barbuda. First, let me thank you very much for this video conference and the presentations from the various presenters. Just a quick question. In terms of, I know that in Grenada's presentation that Mr. Brazam indicated that they had 3 reference weeks or reference periods to this upcoming collection period. How exactly that will work in terms of when you're compiling the information. And for Belize, indicated that they're using a listing exercise to develop the sample frame, and they provided their experience with using telephone numbers, accessing administrative data in terms of developing the sample frame for the survey. How exactly, in terms of, just expand a bit in terms of doing the listing exercise, given the COVID-19, if there's not concerns of still contact with individuals and the field staff having contact with individuals, how exactly that will be done. And then in terms of just back to Grenada, they're using a hybrid system of CATI with what that means in terms of weighting, given that they have changed their sample sizes.
Thank you, Stachel. So can we go to Halim first, and then we go to Diana to have the response?
Yes. Thank you for your question, Stachel. So in terms of the reference week, what I was saying is that we have that sample that we have, that 600 plus households that we already have for the sample. Well, it's actually 1,052, but we only have 600, just over 600 numbers. But whatever information, whatever contact information we get, we would allocate that. It may not necessarily be divided by 3, but we're going to allocate a fairly large number of households to each reference week, right? And that is being done so that we would capture the seasonality in with what is happening in each month of the second quarter. So it would, at the end of the day, it would give you a better reflection as to what the unemployment rate is for the quarter, as opposed to using what we used to use, which is a reference week in the last month of the quarter. Because if you realize that that one reference week in that 1 month may not be representative of the entire quarter. So we sort of spread the sample over the entire quarter. Now, another approach that we have been considering was using a rolling reference week. But our concern is that, like, for example, say in the last week, but our concern is that if once we move out of that quarter, say like the second week in the next quarter, then the information for the last week would not be relevant because you would have gone into a new quarter. So so that is why we chose the 3 reference week to have that a better representation of every month. And in terms of the weighting, that we foresee that that will be a challenge, and that is why we probably need to, with standard error analysis and these things, we probably need to look and see what indicators we can actually disseminate, but we may not be able to disseminate or disaggregate at lower levels. It might be where we normally disaggregate at a national level, but in terms of certain particular variables, we may not be able to disseminate information on those based on after we do our statistical analysis. Thank you.
Orlando, this is Kieran. May I just say something on the weighting issue?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I think Andres in the presentation covered some of the issues around weighting, calibration, non-response adjustment quite well. This is something we also touch on in our guidance. And why we can say that what Grenada is doing is a form of hybrid CATI, the reality is that, I mean, at least as I understand it, the entire sample that's covered is covered by one mode, one approach, right? So per se, you're not merging 2 different types of approach in the same data set. So you don't necessarily need 2 weighting schemes for 2 different data sets. I suppose that's what I'm getting at. Now, that said, it may well be valid to update the weighting approach for that data set you get, because you now have higher non-response expected, and you may want to look at, you know, a multi-stage approach, which you may or may not already have. You know, a first stage that looks at non-response adjustment, which may be different than it was before, and then a second stage which can be weighting or calibration to other population totals. But I think Andre's presentation was quite good on this, and I'm sure the ECLAC colleagues and ourselves would be happy to try and give some additional input to countries who are looking at those challenges. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that about weighting. But sorry, one other thing is that if you do look at changing your weighting approach, firstly, you can at least simulate that with old data, so you don't need to wait to have the new data. It would be a good idea to already look at options. And secondly, you may want to consider applying it to the old data and perhaps publishing revisions if you discover that the alternative weighting approach you now have would have made a difference to old results. It might not, or it might. You'll only know that if you actually use it on your old data. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Now I give the voice to respond to Diana. Diana, sorry.
Yes. Okay, so the question I think was if we had any concerns about conducting a listing exercise in the field, given that there will have to be some face-to-face contact with the household. before planning any field work, any work in the field, we are looking first and foremost to guidance from the Ministry of Health in terms of what is allowed and what is not allowed. At this time, because we have no positive cases and the ministry continues to do random testing and they have as yet detected no more cases, we are allowed to do certain activities face-to-face. Things like masks are mandatory, of course. So in assessing, the risks involved with the listing exercise, we're looking at the fact that it will involve very minimal contact because the listing will be, there's far less contact involved than doing an entire labor force survey questionnaire. Persons don't necessarily need to even go inside the house of the respondent or anything like that. It's short. It can be done with the social distancing requirement met. And we will ensure that our interviewers who go out to do the listing are issued their protective gear, their masks, their sanitizers, and things like that. So we are aware that there's always some kind of risk, but just looking at our situation right now, and looking at how we have to adapt to what may come later on in the year or next year, it's something that we decided that we had to do, and we will protect our staff as best as we can and maintain all the social distancing requirements that the Ministry of Health has recommended.
Okay, thank you very much, Diana. I have another a question from to Halim from Rohan Anthony. If you want to, I have he writes it in the chat, but if you want to mention it, Rohan, we can open your telephone, your microphone.
It's open. Hi, yes. Yes, Halim, I just wanted to know if, okay, you said you did not shorten your questionnaire for the telephone survey. So I just wanted to know if you did not get any concerns from your respondents with regard to the length of the questionnaire.
Thank you, Rohan.
So for the fourth quarter 2019, we use the survey just as it is. Another thing about it, our interviewers have been doing these surveys a long time now, so they're highly trained. But I have not, we have not received a high non-response, and I have not received any complaints that the questions were too long. The interview was actually carried out in a time where most persons were on lockdown, basically. So we had a reasonably good reception, and we did some PR. We did a release indicating to the public that we will be continuing our surveys. Now for this quarter, we try removing some questions, but I think we probably need further advice on what questions that we can actually remove, because when we looked at it and we were having the meeting, realized that, well, this question is still very important, so why should we remove it, right? But we did remove some questions, but then we had additional questions to include to make the questionnaire COVID relevant, right? So we still ended up with quite a large questionnaire. So maybe as time goes on and depending on the response that we get from the upcoming survey, then we will see what questions that we probably should remove to make things easier. And of course, advice from ECLAC and ILO on which are the questions that from the standard LFS methodology that we can remove. Thank you.
Thank you, Halim. I have another question that I think is more general and I don't know if our colleagues from ILO or StatCan or us can respond. It has to be from. It comes from Tracelyn Joseph from Antigua and Barbuda. If you can open the microphone for Antigua and Barbuda, or if she wants, I can read the question. Whatever. Tracelyn? We cannot hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Who is the person that you want to open the microphone?
She told me that you can read it. Tracelyn Joseph.
Oh, okay. There. Now it's open.
Tracelyn?
Can you hear us?
Here.
Perfect. Please don't close your microphone. The microphone could have to be gray, don't red.
Okay.
That's
You can
it.
hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Very good presentation. My question is about the telephone numbers. From our observation on doing our face-to-face interviews, a lot of persons, their phone numbers are cell phone numbers, which are not listed. So how do we handle this? Our listed numbers are in the phone book. They're from the landlines, and some of them are also private. And some persons do not like to give their phone numbers as well. Sometimes they give you a wrong phone number just to give you a number. So how do we handle this with the CATI?
Who wants to respond from our colleague from Kiran or StatCan or us?
I can, attempt to respond to that, Orlando. Yeah, there are a lot of issues to consider with phone number coverage, which is practically why the approach of going back to old samples is attractive, assuming, of course, you captured phone numbers from that old sample. But what I would say is, right, again, we work on the assumption you want to maintain your sample design, okay? So you have to use whatever source of information you can to achieve as high coverage of telephone contact details as you can. And for most countries, that's unlikely to be just one source only. Now, from there, one of the things we recommend is that you do, assuming you have the time to do it, some form of testing of coverage, right? So take a subset of your selected sample, look at your ability to get contact details from various sources, including what households have provided from previous samples, and you can attempt to make contact to see what level of actual valid contact details you have. And then when you're missing, you can, depending on what you're missing, you can consider your strategies to make up for the uncovered part. So if it's 20% okay, that's one thing. Then you need to try and see how biased that 20% is and what ways you might try to fill in that gap, whether it's searches online, whether it's attempts to reach out through, because you have an address and you can send out a letter, you know, response cards, as I believe the colleague from Grenada was mentioning. And through all these means, attempt to achieve as high and unbiased a coverage as you possibly can. But this is the type of thing you're talking about is precisely why countries are concerned that they will have high non-response, higher non-contacts than normal, higher refusal than normal. So again, the issue will be that when you have done your best by whatever means to cover that sample, what are you left with? And as Andres pointed out in his presentation, and I know he's not here to answer, but he was pointing out that you have to do this assessment of, well, is my coverage good enough? Is my achieved sample good enough to publish? And you know, that is a mix of the number of households you got and how unbiased or biased it is. So that's it. I mean, the points you're raising, they're valid and they exist in every country. Right? I mean, some respondents will not want to provide telephone numbers. Some respondents will not have telephone numbers, or you may not, even if they have them, be able to get them. Right? So, you know, they are absolutely valid issues, and the right solution is going to ultimately come from the country level. What level of coverage can you get there from the various sources available to you? So I hope that partially answers, at least.
Thank you, Kieran. And I have another question. If we can open the floor for Jenny Seymour. She has a question from to Belize.
Okay.
Yes?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So in Grenada's presentation, one of the challenges was the fact that suddenly the World Bank was not offering the server to store the information coming from survey solutions. So I was wondering if that will also be a challenge for Belize when they go into their LFS in September, or if they have already a local server, or maybe just to share that information, because I know that was definitely a challenge for Grenada, and it's something that we are also discussing within the PRAS team, because I know that might be an impact for a lot of countries. I was just wondering what Belize had in mind, or if they had any other options in terms of servers.
Thank you very much, Diana.
Yes, I believe maybe I have to do a quick verification with our IT people, but I believe that we are hosting all our data on our own servers. We had built up our server capacity in preparation for the census, so I do not think that we are using the World Bank servers to store our data.
Thank you, Diana. So we are close to the end, and so I would like to give the voice to our colleague Javier Mancero from our statistics division. Javier, you have the voice.
Thank you, Rolando, and thank you all the participants for the very good presentations. I just wanted to raise two brief points. One is that I think in the presentation from Belize was very well put. This is a challenging situation, but it also offers us many opportunities to move ahead and innovate in our ways of collecting data. That obviously gives the way to many new questions, and for that we are available together. We're working very closely together with ILO here in the region. So for things like were in the presentation from Andres, what to do with the survey design, how to test for biases, etc. We can work together if you require our support. And also, already Elisa Benes, for example, in the chat has offered additional information on the reduction of questionnaires or things that can be worked directly with ILO. So I wanted just to raise this point. Thank you very much for the participation. Thank you, Roland.
Thank you, Javier. I don't have more questions, so and we are on time. So with this, I want to thank all the participants, Kieran, Andres, Diana, and Halim. And I want to thank the collaboration and participation of our colleagues from Stats Canada that are giving a strong and very important support for the Caribbean countries. Thank you on your behalf, on behalf of the Stats Canada. Claudio, please give our gratitude for this support on behalf of ECLAC. And of course, our colleagues from ILO, Kieran, thank you very much. Elisa, thank you very much. And of course, our friend Marcela Cabezas, which is in Santiago with us. Thank you very much to all of you. And thank you for our colleagues from the Chile, Olga Barquero, for the great support for this knowledge transfer and this participation. And thank all of you. And with this, I'll give you have a very good afternoon, and thank you very much. I hope to hear something from you in the next days. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you and bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.